So for this video and the next video, we're going to talk about physical components of Active Directory, and then we're going to talk about the logical components of Active Directory. So I'm only going to introduce concepts and ideas that pertain to this course. On the logical side, I am going to introduce some concepts and ideas that are out of scope for the course, but I think are still important. But for the physical side, I'm going to limit it to what's in scope as to not confuse you or make things any more complicated, because Active Directory can run really deep, really fast. So we're going to give a high-level overview, and then it'll make a lot more sense once we start building things out. So let's talk about two very important physical Active Directory components. So the very most important Active Directory component is what is called a domain controller. So if you've never heard of a domain controller, that is the head honcho of all the servers, right? When you set up Active Directory, you have what is called a domain controller. Now, the domain controller has a lot of features that it provides and does for the environment. It hosts what is called the Active Directory Domain Services Directory Store, meaning it hosts your phone book. Remember, we talked about it being a phone book? It has all the information on the users, the computers, what printers are in the network, etc. It knows everything. On top of this, it's providing authentication and authorization. So going back to the last video when we talked about Kerberos, it's doing that at the domain controller level. And if we're in what's called a forest, or in a domain where we have a parent-child situation, which we're going to talk about in the logical side of things, it does replication, so that way the other forests or other domains, when you make an update to one item in one domain controller, it updates across the board. Now, we'll talk about that here in just a second. But also, we have administrative access with the domain controller. So that is to manage user accounts and network resources. As you're going to see when we build our domain controller, what we do is we go in there, and this is where we can add users. This is where we can add our computers, where we can add policies, where we can do all different sorts of things. We do it at the domain controller level. So when we talk about domain controller, again, it's the head honcho, it's the top dog. When we attack an internal network, it's very bad if we can compromise your domain controller, because that means we can compromise the whole network potentially. So depending on how big the network is, if it's just one domain and we compromise the domain controller, we've compromised everything, okay? So this is one of the top targets when you're doing an internal assessment, though it's not the only target. And I should note, do not get your eyes set on just doing domain controller compromise and that being it when it comes to Active Directory pen testing or internal pen testing. There's other information that clients might want as well. Think about potentially PII, or personally identifiable information, especially if it's related to like social security numbers or sensitive information about people. Think about any kind of credit card information that might be obtained. Think about any kind of proprietary information that you might be able to obtain as well. So don't just go for domain admin or compromising the domain controller. Think beyond that. Think, what could you do as an attacker that would be really damaging to a client? Now, from here, let's also talk about Active Directory data stores. So the big takeaway from the Active Directory data store is that it holds this file called the ntds.dit, D-I-T. Okay, and this file is very sensitive. Now, typically, when you compromise a domain controller, you want to grab this file. Why do we want to grab this file? Well, it contains everything that is stored in Active Directory data. That means all the users, the objects, the groups, etc. More importantly, it contains password hashes for all users in that domain. So when you compromise that domain controller and then you go get the ntds.dit file, guess what? You've got all the password hashes. Doesn't mean you have all the passwords, but you have the hashes. You can take them offline, try to crack them. You can attempt pass the hash attacks. You can attempt golden ticket attacks with the hash. And I know you might not know what all of these are right now, but we're going to see why compromising this NTDS file will lead to amazing things as an attacker for us when we get into the attacking side of things. So that's all I want you to take away from this. I want you to take away these two components, a domain controller and the data store. because the domain controller is one of our primary targets as an attacker. That is the big cheese, right? We want to attack it. We want to compromise it because that's where all the data is stored. That's what's doing our authentication. That is where everything about anything is there. And we're going to live inside of the domain controller for a while. When we're doing our lab build, we set everything up. We set up our policies. You're going to get a good feel for what exactly you can do on a domain controller. And then know the data store. The data store has this NTDS file, and that file includes all information from Active Directory data, including password hashes. Big, big, big thing to remember. So that's it. From here, we're going to talk quickly about logical items, and then we're going to move on to building our lab, which is going to be super exciting.